Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the second half of today's lecture, where we're going to be looking at the saltwater ecosystems, whereas last time we looked at freshwater ecosystems. So when looking at saltwater ecosystems, the first area you look at is the intertidal zone. And this is going to be the very narrow range where your ocean, your saltwater body, maybe a ocean, maybe a sea, interacts with your coastline. And tides tend to be the rising and falling of water. That's what a tide is. It's when the ocean comes in towards land and rises and then goes out towards the ocean and falls. And it's actually caused by the rotation of the moon, right? So the moon circles the globe and exerts a gravitational force on the oceans. And as the ocean is pulling on the water away from the coastline, the tides go out. And as the moon moves over the land and pulls the water towards the land, the tides come in. And so you have tides that can be several feet or maybe 1 or 2 meters in change of difference depending on the season and where the moon is in its cycle around the earth. And so this creates a really unique environment where the organisms that live there have to be adept at both being submerged under salt water and being exposed to the open air because the water is not always there. Now, many organisms will migrate into the area when the water drops to feed and then migrate out when the water rises. But some organisms, like clams and oysters, are adept at living in both environments. They open up when the water is over them and they can filter feed, and then when the water drops, they close and are protected by a really hard outer shell that makes them hard to feed upon. And then you have things like crabs and crustaceans that can move with the tides or bury themselves under the ground. Now, the open ocean ecosystem is going to be quite a bit different than the coastal or tidal coastal region because, largely speaking, the nutrients that allow for plants and photosynthetic organisms to prosper are consumed near the coastal region before they get out to the ocean itself. And so the open ocean is largely devoid of life, with the exception of some filter feeders like jellyfish and some rather large migratory organisms like giant squid, whales, or sharks. For the most part, you don't get large numbers of fish far away from the coast, and the further away from the coast you get, the fewer the number of organisms tend to exist, except at the bottom of the ocean, which we'll talk about in a sec. So the benthic zone, this is the area along the ocean's floor that consists primarily of sand, silt, and dead organic material. You get a lot of crustaceans, you get a lot of worms that live there, and you get a lot of filter feeders that will feed from the things that are following. Now, up in terms of shallowness, you can have both the photic zone, just like a lake or a pond, and an aphotic zone out in the middle of the open ocean. In the photic zone, you do get some small algae that can exist in this area, and so you have some filter feeders like jellyfish that will float along in the ocean and eat these, and you have a few other things that'll eat those. For the most part, it's still pretty sparse, and certainly as you go down into what's called the aphotic zone, which is between the photic zone and the benthic zone, you get a very dark area, very little light, very little plankton or algae, and very little things that are alive. You don't have many fish or living organisms in this area. They just migrate through the aphotic zone. Now, the coastal ocean and coral reefs are going to be shallow areas near the land. So if you think about a map of the world, there's an entire inland area called the Gulf of Mexico. It's connected to the ocean, but it's actually really shallow in comparison to the rest of the ocean. And you get a lot of fish and things that live in that shallow, warm water, where there are still a lot of nutrients coming from the land and pooling in that area, and it makes for a very vibrant ecosystem. Coral reefs are similar in terms that they are in shallow, warm waters, but instead of being naturally shallow because of the geography, these are shallow because of a organism called coral that dies and leaves its skeleton kind of like a concrete structure. It's not obviously, it's a coral structure, but it creates this shallow area of warm water near the surface where there's a lot of nutrients, and it creates a place where a lot of fish and a lot of different types of organisms can live and interact. Now, wetlands tend to be characterized by what's called brackish water. Depending on the tide, the water can be somewhat salty or mostly fresh, depending on which direction the water is flowing in, because these are large flat lands connected to the ocean and connected to rivers or streams that feed into them. They're very shallow. They have a wide variety of organisms because there's a lot of aquatic plants that grow in these areas, and there's a lot of small fish and insects that can live in these areas and birds that feed on them. You can get some large crocodiles or um, alligators that live in these regions. And again, because they're shallow and they have a lot of access to nutrients because they're having water flow to them from upstream, you can have a large amount of biodiversity. Now, similar to this are what are known as estuaries. And estuaries are a little bit different than wetlands because these are regions that are shallow that kind of go out from the land, but they're still shallow and they have a collection or pooling of nutrients from a lot of different rivers and stream outlets into them. And so at the bottom of an estuary, you have a lot of silt. This is very finely ground up sand that is deposited. It makes them very shallow, but they're also very lively because anywhere near the coasts of an estuary, you have a lot of plants and you can have a lot of algae and plankton that live in these areas for filter feeders to feed upon, and then things to feed upon the filter feeders. So, again, because of their proximity to land and where the phosphorus and nitrogen are going to be from the rivers, you have very lively ecosystems in estuaries. All right, so that brings us back to our focus question. What are some examples and characteristics of aquatic ecosystems? Well, hopefully I have given you the vocabulary and enough ideas and descriptors to actually answer this question well. And I want to thank you for listening. And I've got some questions and assignments for you to work through. Make sure you ask me questions if you have them, because you know I love questions. Thanks.